They said a wild foal could never survive without its mother, not in the cold winds of Red Mesa, not in a storm that swallowed sound and hope alike. But when a lonely cowboy found a 1-month-old colt crying beside its fallen mare, something in him, something long buried, stirred back to life. He didn't know that saving that tiny creature would cost him his solitude, his peace, and the quiet grief he'd lived with for years. Because sometimes, in the heart of the desert, the wild doesn't just ask to be rescued, it comes to rescue you. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from. And if you enjoy this story, don't forget to subscribe. The winter of 1998 hit Red Mesa Valley like a punishment from the sky. Snow had always been a rare visitor in this stretch of New Mexico desert, but that night it came with fury, driven by wind that tore through the canyon's throat and carried sand the color of blood. The air was gray, the horizon gone. The few ranch houses scattered across the valley went dark, early shutters drawn tight against the storm. Only one light remained faint and flickering from a lonely cabin crouched near the northern tree line. The wind slammed against its tin roof, howling through cracks and broken shingles. Inside, a single kerosene lamp burned on the table, its flame shivering every time the house did. Jack Renier pulled his old leather coat from the wall hook and slipped it over his flannel shirt. The motion was slow, deliberate, as if every layer weighed more than the last. His boots thudded across the wooden floor. When he opened the door, the wind screamed in, carrying flakes sharp enough to sting his cheek. He braced himself against the frame, looked out at the night, and muttered, "Let's get this over with." Jack was in his early 40s, though most people would have guessed older. Years of dust smoke and loss had carved their record across his face. His hair, once black, was now the color of ash. His beard had gone to iron and silver. His eyes, a pale gray, carried a distance that no one dared to close. Once he'd worked for the Forest Service, patrolling, protecting, helping ranchers fight wildfires in the South Ridge. But that was before 1993, before the fire that took his wife and daughter. The small photograph inside the locket around his neck had faded almost to ghosts, a smiling woman with long hair, a little girl clutching a foal by the mane. He kept it close, tucked under his shirt, a relic of another life. Since that day, Jack had built himself a quiet exile in the valley, just him, the mountains, and the silence. He fixed fences, grew vegetables, hunted when he had to. He didn't go to town. He didn't answer the mail. The world had already taken what it wanted from him. There was no reason to give it anything more. That night, the temperature dropped below 10 degrees. The wind rattled the fence wire, a metallic clatter that echoed like a warning bell. Jack stepped out to check the posts, his flashlight cutting a narrow beam through the blizzard. The world outside had no color, only motion. White snow, red dust, black sky. The wind was alive, clawing at him with icy hands. Every sound was swallowed by it, every step an effort against the force that wanted him down. He followed the fence-line, boots sinking deep into snowdrifts. And then through the roar of the wind, something pierced the noise. A cry, small, broken, desperate. Jack froze. The sound came again, faint, somewhere to the north, beyond the pines. It wasn't human, but it wasn't wind either. He frowned, raising the light toward the trees. What in hell? He stood there, debating the sanity of walking farther. But the sound came once more, sharper this time, a thin, trembling whinny that could only come from a foal. He clenched his jaw, tightened his coat around him, and started toward the noise. "Hang on, whatever you are," he muttered. "I'm coming." The trek through the trees felt endless. Each gust shoved him sideways, forcing him to crouch low and press forward his flashlight, flickering weakly. The ground had turned to a patchwork of ice and mud, where snow mixed with the red dust of the valley floor. He could smell something strange through the cold smoke, faint but real. The kind that doesn't belong in a snowstorm. When he reached the edge of the pines, his boot slipped, and the beam of light swept over a small clearing. What it revealed made him stop breathing. A mare lay collapsed on her side, her coat scorched black across the shoulder. Steam rose faintly from the burned patch where lightning had struck. The air smelled of singed hair and iron. The snow around her had melted into a ring of slush, now refreezing at the edges. Beside her, a foal no more than a month old struggled to stand. Its tiny legs folded under it again and again. It pressed its nose into the mare's neck, nudging, pawing weakly, letting out small, choking cries. Each sound was raw enough to tear something open in him. Jack lowered the light, swallowed hard, and whispered, "Oh no." He moved closer, kneeling beside the foal. The little creature flinched, eyes wide whites, showing in terror. But it didn't have the strength to move away. The beam of the flashlight caught those eyes, dark, wet, full of confusion and pain. Jack's throat tightened. He had seen that look before in a mirror 20 years ago, the night the fire took everything. The foal pushed once more against its mother's side, gave a weak cry, and fell forward too tired to rise. Its breathing came shallow, uneven. Steam rose from its nose, fading quickly in the wind. Jack reached out, a trembling hand touched the tiny head. The coat was soaked cold as stone. Beneath it, just barely, he felt the flutter of a heartbeat. His mind flickered with his wife's voice, faint but clear. "Don't you ever walk away from something still fighting to live." Jack swallowed. He shrugged off his heavy coat and wrapped it around the foal's trembling body. The weight of the animal surprised him, light but fragile, like holding a secret. He pulled it close against his chest, shielding it from the wind. "Don't die on me, kid," he whispered into its ear, voice breaking. "Not while I'm here." The foal didn't move, but its head, small and damp, pressed faintly against his chest, an instinctive search for warmth, or maybe for faith. Jack lifted the foal into his arms, staggering as the snow reached his knees. Lightning cracked across the ridge, painting the valley in silver for an instant. The man, the storm, the small bundle in his arms. He trudged back toward the faint golden glow of his cabin, each step carving a story that the storm immediately tried to erase. By the time he reached the barn behind his house, his fingers were numb, his coat gone, his breath ragged. But he kept walking one foot at a time until the door slammed shut behind him. Outside, the blizzard raged on. Inside, for the first time in years, something warm began to stir inside Jack Renaer's chest, a pulse that wasn't just his own. The barn was little more than bones and memory. Dust clung to every beam. Spiderwebs laced the corners. The air smelled of rot hay and time. It hadn't housed a living thing in 5 years, not since Jack buried his family. He set the foal down gently onto a pile of dry straw. Its body shivered violently, sides heaving, hooves scraping weakly at the ground. Jack struck a match or lit the old stove in the corner. The flame caught after 3 tries, spreading a hesitant glow through the barn. The light revealed walls scarred by age, rusted tools, and an old saddle hanging from a nail. Jack pulled a wool blanket from a trunk, wrapped it tight around the foal, and crouched beside it. He cupped his hands and breathed warm air over its neck again and again until the steam from his breath mingled with the smoke from the fire. Outside, the storm screamed against the boards. Inside, there was only the faint rhythm of breathing, his and the foal's 2 heartbeats struggling against the same darkness. Jack rummaged through the cupboards until he found a dusty bottle and a half jar of goat's milk leftovers from a neighbor's visit months ago. He poured it into a pot, heated it on the small iron stove until it steamed, then filled an old glass bottle with the warm liquid. He knelt again beside the foal, shaking the bottle gently. "Come on, kid. Try this." The foal's mouth didn't move. Its head lolled breath so shallow he could barely see it. Jack clenched his teeth. "Don't you do that. You fought too damn hard already." He pressed the bottle's tip to its lips. A drop slid down, then another. Nothing. He sighed, repositioned, and whispered, "You're gonna drink, you stubborn little thing." He tilted the bottle again. One drop found its way onto the foal's tongue. A flicker. Another drop. Then the faintest motion, its tongue shifted and it swallowed. Jack froze. Then a short, shaky laugh broke through his breath. "That's it," he said softly. "That's it, you got it." He kept going, patient, measured, until half the bottle was gone. The foal's breathing steadied barely, but enough. When it finally stopped, exhausted, Jack set the bottle aside and leaned back, chest rising and falling with the rhythm of survival. "You still want to live?" he murmured. "That's all that matters." The hours stretched thin. Jack sat beside the fire, his back against the wall, the foal curled close under the blanket. The snow outside had stopped, leaving only the occasional sigh of wind brushing through the cracks. He stared into the flames. The shape of the little horse blurred, and for a moment he saw another small figure, a child hair golden in the sunlight, laughing beside a white mare. His throat burned. He spoke softly, half to the animal, half to the ghosts. "You're looking for your mother, huh?" "Yeah. I used to look for mine too. Used to call out, wait for someone to answer. Sometimes the wind was the only thing that ever did." His voice cracked. The foal twitched, a small sound escaping its throat, almost like a sigh. Jack bowed his head, covered his eyes with his hands. The room filled with the sound of his breathing, uneven, breaking but alive. Two survivors side by side, one man, one creature each, clinging to the fragile warmth of a fire they weren't sure would last till morning. Near midnight, the fire burned low. Jack dozed off, only to be startled awake by a sound, a soft, trembling whinny. The foal was stirring. It lifted its head slightly, its legs moving weakly through the straw. Jack's heart kicked in his chest. He crawled forward, his hand finding the little heartbeat again, stronger this time. For the first time that night, he let himself cry without holding back. The tears fell onto the foal's coat, darkening it in spots that quickly cooled to silver. He pressed his forehead against its neck and whispered, "I'm calling you Storm. Found you in the middle of one, didn't I? Maybe you're the storm that's gonna wake me up again." The words came slow, unsure, but they filled the air with meaning. Storm's ear flicked at the sound of his voice, and that tiny, tired movement was enough to make Jack smile through the tears. He pulled the blanket tighter, pushed the straw closer to the stove, and watched as the light flickered across the foal's coat, turning damp hair into a halo of firelight. In that dim barn, a name became a promise. The wind outside softened to a whisper. Inside, the fire shrank to glowing coals, throwing slow, dancing shadows against the wooden wall. Jack stretched out on the ground, half covered by the same blanket that wrapped the foal. His hand rested near its neck. Storm shifted slightly, curling into the space beside him, tiny chest rising and falling against his arm. The air still smelled of smoke and earth, but the cold was gone. Jack exhaled long, letting exhaustion and relief mix in equal parts. "Sleep, Storm," he murmured. "Tomorrow will be better." He looked at the foal one last time, its small body tucked in, closed head resting in trust, and closed his eyes. Thoughts came and went, like flickers of flame. Maybe it wouldn't survive the night. Maybe neither of them would. But for the first time in years, Jack didn't care about what would happen in the morning. Because tonight, in the smallest corner of a dying storm, he wasn't alone. Morning came slowly to Red Mesa. The wind had died in the night, leaving behind a silence so deep it felt sacred. Pale sunlight broke through the dust-coated window of the old barn, cutting a golden stripe across the straw and the sleeping forms inside. Dust motes floated in the beam, turning the air into a quiet dance of light. Jack stirred the stiffness in his shoulders, reminding him of how long he'd slept on the cold ground. For a moment, he wasn't sure if the little creature beside him was still breathing. Then he heard it, a faint shuffle, a soft grunt. He looked over. The foal was standing. Its legs trembled under its tiny body knees, wobbling, but it was upright, alive, stubborn, impossible. It blinked at him, ears twitching, eyes bright with reflected sunlight. Then it let out a small, uncertain whinny. Jack froze. Then, for the first time in years, he laughed a rough, unsteady laugh that felt foreign in his chest. "Well, look at you," he said hoarsely. "You really are a storm. Can't even wait a day to start fighting again." Outside, the clouds were breaking apart. The sun spilled over the valley, melting the snow into thin rivulets that trickled past the fence posts. Red Mesa shimmered under the thaw, half winter, half spring alive again. By mid-morning, Jack was rolling up his sleeves. He hadn't touched the barn in 5 years. Most of the roof was caved in, the boards warped and gray. But today the sight of it didn't sting, it called to him. He found his hammer and a handful of old nails, climbed up onto the ladder, and began to patch the roof with tin sheets scavenged from the shed. Each strike of the hammer rang through the air like a heartbeat, echoing through the valley. Storm followed him everywhere, curious and unafraid. The foal nosed through the straw, tugged playfully at the end of his flannel shirt, and once managed to steal a glove right out of his pocket. "Hey," Jack barked, then shook his head, smiling despite himself. "You little thief." The hammering continued, steady, rhythmic cleansing. When he finished, he stepped back and surveyed the place. The roof no longer leaked. The light came through clean gaps instead of broken ones. The smell of new hay filled the air. Jack turned to the foal, resting a hand on the gate. "There," he said softly. "That's your home now. Not bad for an old man, huh?" Storm nickered a faint, high-pitched sound that almost sounded like approval. Jack laughed again, shaking his head. Smartass. The next morning, he opened the stall door and stood aside. Storm hesitated for a moment, nose twitching at the cold air. Then, with an awkward step, it walked out onto the thawing ground. Its knees bent too much, its legs slid a little, but it stayed upright. Jack followed slowly, arms crossed, watching like a father watching a child learn to walk. "Easy now." "That's it," he murmured. The foal took another step, then another. Its balance improved with every try. After a few minutes, it started to trot awkwardly at first, then with surprising grace. Jack chuckled, his chest warming. He hadn't felt that in years. "Show off," he said. When he called its name Storm, the foal stopped, turned its head, ears pricking up. It let out a soft whinny in answer. That one simple exchange hit him harder than he expected. That night, Storm slept curled near the stove, its breathing slow and steady. Jack sat nearby with an old leather-bound notebook, the one his wife used to keep. The pages were filled with sketches of fences, notes about breeding horses, dreams of expanding their ranch. He turned a page, then closed it carefully, and looked at the sleeping foal. "Maybe you came to remind me," he whispered, "that it's not over yet." The next week, the roads cleared enough for Jack to make a trip into town. His supplies were low, especially milk and hay. He drove the old Ford pickup through the winding dirt road, its engine coughing in protest against the cold. The small town of Mesa Creek looked the same as always. A feed store, a cafe, a post office that hadn't changed its paint since Reagan was in office. Jack parked beside the feed store and stepped inside. The smell of grain and coffee hit him instantly. Behind the counter stood Nora Valdez, the owner of Valdez Ranch, mid-30s, dark hair, tied-back sleeves rolled to the elbows. Her face was strong, sun-worn, but her eyes were kind. When she saw Jack, she blinked in surprise. "Well, I'll be damned. I thought you vanished off the face of the earth." Jack managed a small grin. Almost did. Guess the storm didn't get the memo. Nora crossed her arms, studying him. "What brings you out? Need lumber feeds, all right. Just looking for some milk, and maybe some hay if you've got it." Her brow furrowed. "Milk for what?" He hesitated, rubbing the back of his neck. "A foal. Found it out by the ridge. Its mother didn't make it." Her expression softened, but concern shadowed her voice. "A wild one. You know that's federal property, Jack. You're not supposed to keep Mustangs." "I'm not keeping it," he said quietly. "Just keeping it alive. That's all." She studied him for a moment, his tired eyes, the dirt under his nails, the faint tremor in his hand. Then she smiled faintly. "You always did have a habit of saving broken things." Jack shrugged. "Maybe I just know what it feels like." Nora exhaled, then reached under the counter. "I've got fresh milk and some bread left over from this morning. I'll drop by later. You probably haven't eaten anything that didn't come from a can." He started to protest, but she waved a hand. "Don't argue. You're still the most stubborn cowboy in this valley, but even you can't out-stubborn kindness." As he left, she called after him, voice warm but teasing. "Guess Red Mesa finally found something that could thaw you out." True to her word. Nora came by the next afternoon, her truck rattling up the dirt road with boxes in the back. She carried milk, bread, a few tools, and even an old saddle she said wasn't much good for riding anymore, but looked lonely sitting in the barn. Storm was the first to greet her. The little horse trotted to the gate, tail flicking, and let out a cheerful whinny. Nora laughed. At least someone around here remembers their manners. Jack leaned on the fence, amused. "He's been waiting on that milk, not you." "Sure," she said with a smirk. "Keep telling yourself that." Over the next few weeks, her visits became more frequent. Sometimes she brought food, sometimes just conversation. Jack found himself looking forward to the sound of her truck tires crunching over the gravel, the way her laughter filled the empty yard. They talked about simple things, whether grazing the old Mustang herds that used to thunder through Red Mesa before the droughts drove them south. Sometimes she'd tell him stories about her late husband, how they built their ranch together before he passed. Jack listened more than he spoke, but slowly something inside him began to shift. He caught himself repairing the porch, cleaning the windows, tending the small patch of garden behind the house. The cabin no longer looked abandoned, it breathed again. At night, the glow of the fireplace no longer felt like a memorial flame. It was warm, alive, reflected in the brass kettle and the small mirror over the mantel. Storm would curl near the doorway, head resting on his hooves, while Jack sat in his chair, staring into the fire. He thought of how 3 months earlier this house had been silent as a grave. Now it echoed with footsteps, laughter, and the gentle rhythm of hooves outside. Jack leaned back, eyes half closed, and let the peace settle over him. He whispered to himself, "For 3 years I only lived to remember. Now, I think I'm finally living again." From outside, Storm's soft whinny drifted in through the window, an answer, a promise, a sound that filled the night with life. By the next spring, Red Mesa was alive again. The last veins of snow melted through the gullies, running in thin silver lines between the red rocks. New grass pushed through the cracked soil, defying the desert's memory of drought. The valley shimmered under the pale morning sun, gold dust and bird song where, months ago, there had only been wind and silence. Storm had changed. No longer the fragile foal from the blizzard, he now stood nearly to Jack's shoulder, sleek, powerful, his black mane rippling like smoke. The wild light in his eyes had deepened, grown sharp with curiosity, and something older than trust. Jack rose early every morning, leaning on the fence, coffee steaming in his hands, and watched Storm run. The colt's hooves struck the wet ground in rhythmic bursts, scattering droplets of water that caught the sunrise and turned to fire in the air. Each stride carried grace, freedom, and a kind of defiance that made Jack's chest tighten with both pride and fear. "You were born to run," he murmured, "not to stay." But still his fingers tightened around the fence post, as if refusing to let go of what he already knew he couldn't keep. When the days grew longer, Jack began to teach Storm the ways of the rope and saddle. He didn't want to tame him, just to build a bridge between them, some small language they could share. At first, Storm allowed it, standing still, as Jack draped the soft rope across his neck. But the moment Jack tried to tighten the laid or lift the halter, the horse's muscles coiled like wire. In a flash, he jerked his head free and bolted hooves pounding across the field. Jack didn't chase him to capture, only to watch. There was something holy about the sight, Storm's dark body cutting across the sunlight, mane whipping through the air like black flame. "Easy, boy," Jack called, breathless. "I'm not trying to cage you. I just want you to understand me." Every day he tried again, patience instead of force. He'd rest the rope on Storm's back, wait until the horse's heartbeat slowed, then remove it. Little by little, the distrust softened. The rope stopped being a threat. It became a message of trust. "You're safe with me." One afternoon, as Jack stood at the corral with the rope in hand, Nora leaned on the fence beside him, her hat tilted low against the sun. "You're not teaching him obedience," she said with a small smile. "You're teaching him freedom." Jack looked at her, then back at the horse. "Maybe because I know what it feels like to lose it." Storm snorted, tossed his head, and galloped toward the horizon, his shadow stretching long against the dirt. Jack watched him go, feeling something inside him stretch to half pride, half ache. It was like watching a child take his first steps away from home. One March morning, a dust trail appeared on the ridge road. Jack shaded his eyes as an old pickup truck came rattling down toward the cabin. When it stopped, a tall man stepped out. Gray hair glasses, calm eyes that missed nothing. "Ethan Cole," Jack said with a faint grin. "Didn't think I'd see you this far out again." "Didn't think I'd have reason to," the vet replied, closing the door. But Nora sent word. "Said you've been playing foster father to a Mustang." Storm, grazing near the fence, lifted his head, ears pricked. He backed up a few steps, watching the stranger with wary curiosity. Cole studied the horse quietly, then nodded. "He's strong. You've done well, Jack." "But you know what he is, right?" Jack wiped his hands on his jeans. "I know. But I couldn't just leave him. He'd have died." Cole's tone grew firmer. "Wild horses aren't pets. You can feed them, raise them, even love them, but they don't forget what they are. One day that instinct comes calling. And when it does, someone could get hurt." Jack was silent for a long moment, eyes on the ground. Then he said softly, "If I haven't forgotten who I am after everything, maybe he hasn't either. Maybe that's what we've got in common." Cole sighed, shaking his head. "You can't fill the holes in your life with something that doesn't belong in it, Jack." "I'm not trying to fill anything," Jack said. His voice was low but steady. I'm just keeping a promise to never walk away from something still fighting to live. Cole's expression softened. He adjusted his glasses. You always were too stubborn for your own good. I'll hold off reporting this for a while. But think hard about what comes next. He turned back toward his truck. When the state finds out, they'll come for him. You can't keep a storm locked up forever. Jack didn't answer. He just stood there, hand resting on the fence as the dust from Cole's truck faded into the horizon. After that, Storm changed. His body grew leaner, faster. His energy sharpened into something restless. Whenever wild horses passed along the far ridge, free mustangs moving like smoke against the red cliffs, Storm would stop whatever he was doing, ears up, eyes bright, muscles trembling. Jack watched him from the porch, unease building in his gut. He knew that look. He'd seen it in men who longed for places they could never go back to. Then one evening, it happened. Jack heard the crash first, the sound of splintering wood. He ran outside just in time to see the corral gate swinging open, dust rising in a golden storm. Storm was gone, streaking toward the horizon. Storm Jack shouted, his voice hoarse, "Come back!" But the only answer was the echo of hooves and the wind rushing through the open plain. He followed on foot until he reached the hill above the valley. Below him, the Mustang herd moved like a living river, 20, maybe 30 of them. In the middle, Storm ran his black coat, gleaming in the dying light. The herd circled him, testing him, welcoming him. He moved with them wild and proud, no longer anyone's to claim. Jack stood there until the sun vanished, the sound of hooves fading into the distance. For the first time, he understood the price of freedom and the quiet heartbreak of giving it. That night, word spread across Red Mesa. A wild black stallion had injured one of Barrett Vance's prize horses, ripped open its flank in a fight near the southern range. By morning, everyone was talking. Barrett, the wealthy ranch owner who controlled half the valley, was furious. That damned Mustang's mine to deal with, he told anyone who'd listen. Next time it shows up, I'll put it down. When Nora brought the news to Jack's cabin, her face was tight with worry. Jack, you need to hide him, she said. Barrett's got men looking. Jack frowned. He didn't mean to hurt anything. He's still just a colt. Barrett doesn't care. That horse he owns is worth more than your whole property. He'll make an example out of this. Jack's voice hardened. If he wants to come here, he'll have to go through me first. That night, he sat outside the barn, rifle resting across his knees. The fire from his lantern threw long shadows on the ground. Storm lay inside, breathing slow and steady, unaware of the world plotting around him. The moonlight caught in his eyes, and for a moment they gleamed like twin embers, wild, fearless, and innocent. Jack whispered, "You don't even know the storm that's coming, do you, boy?" Barrett Vance arrived at sunrise. His truck, a chrome beast that glittered like money, kicked up dust as it stopped by the fence. 2 hired men stepped out with rifles slung low. Barrett followed, his boots polished, his grin sharp enough to cut. He looked around the property like he was already the owner. "Morning, Renair," he said smoothly. "I hear you've been sheltering one of my horses." Jack stepped onto the porch, wiping his hands on a rag. "Not yours, Barrett. I found him half dead in the snow. Nobody's property but his own." Barrett laughed, the sound low and cruel. "Everything in this valley belongs to someone, Jack. The land, the fences, the water, and the horses that cross it. And the law agrees with me." Storm neighed sharply from inside the stall, the sound cutting through the tense air. Barrett's gaze slid toward the noise. That him, the black Mustang, beautiful animal. Shame he doesn't know his place. Jack moved, standing between Barrett and the barn door. "If you're thinking of pulling that trigger, you'll have to shoot me first." Barrett tilted his head, smirking. "You'd die for a horse?" Jack's voice was calm, but his eyes burned. "I'd die for what he represents." The two men stared at each other, one built from greed, the other from loss. Finally, Barrett flicked his cigarette into the dirt. "Suit yourself. I'll be back when I've got the paperwork. You can explain your little miracle to the law." He turned to leave, and from the corner of the property, Nora appeared, watching silent, her expression grave. When Barrett's truck disappeared down the road, she stepped forward. "You just made an enemy. You can't afford Jack." Jack looked out toward the open fields, where the dust was already settling. "Maybe," he said quietly, "but if trouble wants to come knocking, it'll find me home." That evening, the valley was painted in red light. Jack stood on the porch, the wind tugging at his shirt, watching Storm shift restlessly in the stall. The air carried the scent of dust, smoke, and something heavier, an omen of change. He walked to the gate, stroked the stallion's neck. The horse leaned into his touch eyes, flickering in the glow from the cabin window. "You know," Jack whispered, "I think what I'm really holding on to isn't you. It's the part of me that still believes in trust." Storm nudged his shoulder gently, breath warm against his skin. From the distance came a low rumble of thunder, the first storm of summer building over the mesa. Nora's truck pulled away quietly down the road, her taillights vanishing into the dusk. She looked back once, seeing the lone cabin still lit, two silhouettes standing together against the windman, and horse defying the line between freedom and belonging. Jack lifted his face toward the darkening sky, listening to the thunder roll. "Guess we're not done fighting yet," he murmured. And somewhere deep in the valley, nature stirred in reply, a whisper before the storm. By late summer, the air above Red Mesa turned heavy. The heat clung to the valley like breath on glass, still and waiting. Dark clouds gathered over the western ridges, slow swollen and streaked with veins of silver lightning. The wind shifted, carrying the dry scent of metal and dust. Jack stood on his porch hat, low eyes tracing the horizon. He could taste the storm before it came. From the barn, Storm lifted his head, ears twitching, nostrils flaring, as if he could sense it too. The horse's muscles tensed, tail flicking, a shadow of restlessness rippling beneath his skin. Nora arrived in her truck, hair tousled by the rising wind. "You should bring him in deeper," she warned. "This one's going to be bad." Jack nodded. Together, they fastened the stall doors, braced the hinges, and checked the roof. But Storm's eyes flicked to the sky, wide and wild, each flash of lightning mirrored in their depths like fire trapped in a black glass. The wind howled through the valley, and Red Mesa braced itself for another night of reckoning. The first crack of thunder came just after nightfall. Then the heavens opened. Rain slammed against the tin roof, sheets of water blowing sideways. The wind screamed through the eaves like the voice of something ancient and furious. Inside the barn, Storm panicked. His hooves struck the wood again and again, loud as gunfire. He reared, kick twisted in the stall, eyes rolling white in terror. Sweat mixed with rain, turning his coat into a slick of trembling black muscle. Jack grabbed his flashlight and ran his boots sinking into mud with every step. The barn door rattled violently in the gale as he shoved it open. "Storm easy, boy. It's just thunder, I'm here." But the horse couldn't hear him, not through the storm, not through the memory of the sky falling apart. Lightning exploded just outside, lighting the barn in stark frozen frames, Jack's arm outstretched, Storm's eyes wide, wild, unreachable. The stallion screamed, struck the gate, and splintered it clean in half. Jack lunged forward, catching the rope around Storm's neck. The force nearly ripped him off his feet. The rope whipped loose, snapping across his arm and cutting deep. "Damn it, Storm," he shouted, breathless, soaked through. The horse's heart hammered like thunder against his palm, his body trembling between fight and flight. Another blast of lightning cracked overhead. That was the end of it. Storm bolted again, eyes full of sky and terror, searching for a world without walls. Jack stumbled back, chest heaving, the rain already washing blood and mud from his hands. He knew then, if he held on, one of them wouldn't make it through the night. He stepped out into the open yard, the storm swallowing him whole. Rain lashed at his face. His shirt clung to him like a second skin. Every thunderclap vibrated through his ribs. He turned toward the barn, just as Storm slammed against the inner gate again, desperate and terrified. Jack's voice broke through the storm. "Storm." The horse froze just for a heartbeat, ears forward, chest rising and falling in ragged rhythm. Lightning tore open the sky, white light splitting man and beast in two halves of the same moment. Jack dropped the rope. He threw the stall door wide and shouted, "If you need freedom, go. Go." For an instant, time stopped. The rain hung midair. Storm looked at him, really looked, and something passed between them. A silent understanding. A farewell neither of them could speak. Then the horse lunged forward, out into the tempest. His black form vanished into the wall of rain hooves, pounding through mud and wind until even the echoes disappeared. Jack didn't move. He just stood there, water streaming down his face, watching the space where Storm had been. His voice came out low, almost lost to the wind. "Your freedom. For my loneliness." Lightning forked across the mesa, outlining his figure in silver. A lone man in the storm's shoulders squared against the sky, as if he too belonged to the wild. Dawn came gray and hollow. The storm had passed, leaving the world bruised and dripping. The clouds hung low, thick with leftover rain. Mud covered the ground in wide pools that reflected the broken sky. Jack walked the yard in silence. The barn door hung open, creaking softly. Inside, straw was soaked through the halter, lying half buried in the muck. On the floor near the gate, hoof prints pressed deep into the mud, chaotic, circling, then veering outward in a single determined line. He followed them. Through the broken fence, across the sodden field, down toward the edge of the foothills where the land rose toward the mountains. The prints led him through the grass until they simply ended, swallowed by the slope. He stood there for a long while, listening to the wind moving through the wet sagebrush. The air smelled of rain and iron and emptiness. "Go on, boy," he whispered. "If you can live out there, live well. Don't look back." He turned and began the slow walk home. Each step dragged heavy in the mud, the world around him quiet, except for the sound of his boots and the distant drip of water falling from the pines. Behind him, the trail of prints blurred, washed away by the rising mist. That afternoon, the sun struggled to break through the clouds. It glowed weakly over the mesa, pale as an old photograph. Jack sat on the porch with a cup of cold coffee in his hand, staring at the empty corral. The bucket beside the barn clanged in the wind. Somewhere, a shutter banged softly. The sound filled the air like an old echo, familiar, almost comforting in its loneliness. He sat there for a long time, motionless, as though expecting Storm to appear over the ridge again, as though nothing had changed. When the crunch of tires broke the silence, he didn't move. Nora climbed out of her truck, carrying a loaf of bread and a bottle of milk. Her expression said she already knew. "It's gone, isn't it?" she asked quietly. Jack nodded. He picked the right night to leave. "Did you try to stop him?" "No." He looked at the horizon. "I just opened the door." She sighed, standing beside him for a while, eyes following his gaze. "Sometimes," she said softly, "opening the door is the only way to hold on to what matters." Jack didn't answer. The words sank into the silence between them. like rain seeping into soil. They stood there until the light began to fade. The land stretched wide and still before them, red earth wet and shining. In the distance, the faint trace of hoofprints shimmered under the setting sun, before the wind erased them completely. When Nora finally left the house, it grew quiet again. Inside, the fire burned low. Shadows moved across the walls, slow and alive. Jack walked to the barn, the lantern flickering in his hand. He cleaned the stall, swept the straw, drained the puddles, rehung the halter. His movements were careful, reverent, like a man preparing a shrine rather than a stable. When it was done, he stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at the empty space where Storm used to stand. If he ever belonged anywhere, Jack murmured, maybe he'll find his way back. He closed the barn door, but didn't latch it. The night air slipped in, soft and cool. Outside, the sky burned with the last light of evening. Amber bleeding into violet clouds, glowing like dying embers. Red Mesa exhaled the storm's fury, fading into silence. From the porch, the cabin looked small but unbroken, its windows glinting faintly. In their reflection, the firelight flickered like a heartbeat, fragile but alive. And though the corral was empty, the place no longer felt abandoned, because somewhere beyond the ridge, in the wide breadth of the desert, the echo of hooves still lingered, proof that even loss can leave something living behind. 3 days after the tempest, Red Mesa lay under a silence too deep to trust. The grass had turned brittle and gold, the air hung thick and metallic, and the sky pressed low, heavy, waiting. Even the cicadas were quiet, as if the whole valley were holding its breath. Then came the sound of an engine. A chrome truck rolled down the dirt road, trailing dust. Behind the wheel sat Barrett Vance, his expression carved in stone. 3 hired hunters rode with him, rifles propped against the seat rope coiled in the back. They stopped in front of Jack's cabin. The wind stirred a veil of dust between them. Barrett stepped out first. "Your black horse attacked 2 more of mine," he said flatly. "I came to finish what you should have stopped." Jack stood in the yard, unarmed eyes, calm but hard. "You talk about danger to livestock," he said quietly. "But what's really dangerous here is greed." Barrett's grin was sharp as a blade. "I warned you, Renair. Out here, a wild horse has 2 places: behind a fence or in front of a gun." Jack said nothing. His gaze never left the rifle in Barrett's hands. From down the trail, Nora appeared on horseback, shouting over the wind, "Barrett, you fire that gun here and you'll answer for it." He didn't even glance her way. "Stay out of it, Valdez. This is between men." A gust tore across the yard, lifting grit and straw into the air. The sky dimmed. It felt like the earth itself was waiting to see who would move first. Barrett raised his rifle. The black barrel gleamed in the light. It pointed straight toward the barn. Jack stepped forward until the muzzle was level with his chest. "If you want to kill him," he said, voice low and steady, "you'll have to go through me first." Barrett's jaw tightened. "You'd die for a horse." "No," Jack said. "I'd live like a man." The wind roared again, and then another sound rose above it, a long, echoing whinny rolling down from the ridge like thunder. Everyone turned. Through the haze and dust, a shape emerged from the trees. Storm. His black coat shimmered with rain, his breath plumed white in the chill, his eyes burned like coals. He walked slowly into the open field, every step measured certain. Between man and wilderness, he stopped head high, nostrils flaring. Jack whispered, "No, boy. Don't do this." Barrett's mouth twisted. "So that's where you've been hiding?" He lifted the rifle again, sighting along the barrel. "Don't you dare," Nora screamed. The gunshot cracked the air. Jack lunged, striking the rifle upward. The bullet tore through the clouds instead of flesh. Birds burst from the trees in a frenzy of wings. Jack hit the mud hard. Barrett swung the rifle back down, but then he froze. Storm reared hooves, flashing. His whinny tore through the valley like a living storm. The ground shook under him. From far off, other horses answered wild, distant, countless. The hunters faltered. Even Barrett's eyes flicked uncertain. Jack rose slowly, mud and blood mixing down his arm. "Crazy," he rasped. "Maybe, but at least I'm not blind." For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then Barrett spat into the dirt. "Keep your damn monster," he muttered, signaling his men back to the truck. But this isn't over. Engines roared, fading over the hill. Jack stood in the silence left behind, chest-heaving rain beginning to fall again in light silver threads. The fight was done for now. What remained was exhaustion and something close to sorrow. That evening, the world softened. The wind turned cool, the clouds broke into pale strips of silver. Jack stood under the porch light. Storm approached slowly, his steps, measured eyes no longer wild, but watchful. When he stopped beside him, Jack reached out, resting a trembling hand on the horse's neck. "You don't need anyone to tell you you're brave, boy," he said softly. Storm pressed his head against Jack's shoulder, a low rumble vibrating in his chest, a sound more human than animal. From the corral gate, Nora watched in silence. "That's not a horse you're talking to," she said gently. "That's loyalty." Later, as night settled, Jack sat beside the fire. The flames reflected off the window, dancing in Storm's dark eyes, where he lay outside under the eaves. For the first time in years, the quiet around him wasn't loneliness. It was peace. Autumn came to Red Mesa like an apology. The air cooled, the leaves turned copper, and the sun lay low and kind over the valley. One afternoon, Nora's voice crackled over the radio. "Jack, I need help. One of my calves slipped down the west ravine. I can't reach it alone." "I'm on my way," he said, grabbing a coil of rope in his old gloves. Storm followed at his heels as he drove the truck down the dirt road, the engine growling in rhythm with the wind. At the ravine, the calf's cries echoed faintly from below. The ground was slick from last night's rain, the edges soft and treacherous. Jack tied the rope around a boulder and looped it around his waist. Storm stood at the top ears, flicking nervously. "Easy," Jack said, smiling up. "Just keep an eye out for me." He descended carefully, boots scraping stone. Mud clung to his hands, the rope bit into his palms. He reached the calf trembling and wedged between two rocks. "You're all right," he murmured, cutting the loop from its leg. Then the earth shifted. The ledge beneath him gave way with a sharp crack. Jack fell hard, hitting the rocks before everything went black. Above, Storm screamed. Rain began to fall again, a sudden mountain shower. The horse circled the edge, searching for a way down. When he couldn't find one, he threw back his head and whinnied a desperate, piercing cry that rolled across the canyon. Then he turned and ran. Through mud and brush, through the scattered pine. Storm charged down the slope toward Nora's ranch. His hooves pounded the earth like thunder. Nora heard him before she saw him, the frantic rhythm, the broken breathing. She ran out to the yard. "Storm, what's wrong?" The horse was drenched, trembling eyes wide with terror. He tossed his head toward the mountains, snorting, stamping, and let out a long, urgent whinny. Nora froze, heart leaping. "Jack." She grabbed the radio. "Ethan, it's Jack's hurt West Ravine. Bring your gear now." Minutes later, Cole's truck tore down the road, a rescue team behind him. Storm ran ahead of them the whole way, never slowing, never straying from the path. At the ravine, he stopped abruptly, rearing and pounding the ground, directing them to the very spot where Jack lay unconscious. Cole dropped beside him, checking for a pulse. "He's alive," he said, voice tight. "Barely." They lifted Jack onto a stretcher, loading him into the back of the truck. As the vehicle pulled away, Storm stood motionless in the rain, watching the red flash of the taillights fade into the mist. His breath steamed in the cold air, mingling with the rain, half spirit, half storm. When Jack woke, the first thing he smelled was antiseptic. The steady beep of a monitor counted his heartbeats like a distant metronome. He opened his eyes to the soft light filtering through a hospital window. Outside, behind the glass, stood a familiar shadow. Storm. The stallion was still, his coat damp from the drizzle, head bowed slightly, as if waiting. Jack's swallowed voice hoarse. "You found me," he whispered. "Good boy. You really found me." The door opened. Dr. Ethan Cole stepped in, smiling. "You owe that horse your life, Jack. He led us straight to you. Without him, you'd have bled out before dawn." Jack's eyes misted. "I told you," he said weakly. "He knows who I am." A knock on the frame. Nora entered, holding 2 cups of coffee. "Looks like he finally paid his debt," she said, smiling softly. "Now you've got to live for both of you." Cole adjusted the chart at the foot of the bed. "Broken leg, couple of ribs. You'll need crutches for a while, but you'll heal." Jack nodded, gaze never leaving the window. Outside, Storm shifted his weight mane, rippling in the wind. The horse lifted his head and gave a low, gentle whinny that carried faintly through the glass, a sound too soft. For the wild, too deep for words. Jack closed his eyes, tears mixing with a smile. In that moment, he understood what the desert had been trying to teach him all along, that nature never truly takes it, returns in its own language, at its own time. The storm had come full circle, and through the thin pane of glass, 2 souls, one man, one creature of the wild, breathed in rhythm again, alive beneath the same endless sky. 6 weeks later, they wheeled Jack to the hospital doors where the sun lay warm and honest across the parking lot. Nora pulled her old pickup close and helped him into the passenger seat, his crutches rattling in the footwell. The ride home was slow and easy, the mesa rolling out like a memory he could finally look at without flinching. Red Mesa Ranch appeared at the crest of the road fence lines, mended roof, patched the barn door slightly ajar, like a mouth ready to speak again. When Nora cut the engine beside the gate, a dark shape was already waiting there. Storm stood motionless, ears forward, body coiled, as if he'd been holding his breath for weeks. At the squeal of the brakes, he let out a ringing whinny and trotted in a quick circle, barely able to contain himself. Nora laughed under her breath. "He's been camped by that gate every morning," she said. "Guess he figured today was the day." Jack swung out of the truck, clumsy on the crutches, jaw tight against the stab in his ribs. Storm came as if pulled by a rope. Only he could see, snorting softly, careful of the crutches, pressing the warm bridge of his face to Jack's shoulder. The stallion's breath feathered across Jack's neck. Jack chuckled, the sound raw and new. "Told you," he murmured into the black mane voice, breaking with a grin. "I don't die that easy." Nora watched, arms folded, something gentle loosening in her face. "Fate," she said, not quite teasing. "Or something that looks a whole lot like it." Inside, she lit the fire and set a kettle to hum on the stove. The flames jumped, throwing gold across the wood and glass and the old photograph on the mantel. When Jack lowered himself into the chair by the hearth, Storm lingered in the doorway, then lay across the threshold outside, near enough to feel the warmth, far enough to leave the house to humans. 2 survivors in the same pool of light. The cabin crackled and the kettle sighed, and the valley exhaled with them. For a long while, no one spoke. Nothing needed saying. The worst of the storm, both storms had passed. Recovery was its own kind of work, and Jack treated it like a ranch chore, something to be done at dawn, repeated until it took. He started with a lap of the yard on crutches, counting fence posts, letting his breath find a steady rhythm. Storm matched him, step for step head, low tails swishing the flies, drifting close. Whenever Jack's balance wobbled, a living handrail that knew when to lean in and when to give space. Some days the pain made his vision go white at the edges. He'd stop, grit his teeth, and Storm would move his shoulder just under Jack's forearm. "All right," Jack would whisper, forehead pressed to the warm hide. "All right, I'm with you." They'd start again. Nora came most evenings with food and supplies, and jokes dry as mesquite. She'd drop a sack of flour on the counter like she owned the place, then march out to the yard with a hammer tucked into her belt. "Thought I'd help with the south fence," she'd say. "That fence stands just fine," Jack would answer. "Not after I take it down and put it up right." And she'd smile without looking at him and go to work. Repairs multiplied the way tasks do when you finally see what you've ignored. Loose shingles, a cracked trough, a hinge that squealed. Jack found the point where his strength ran out, and Nora found the point where she could push him without breaking him. They were good at this, the measured banter, the long silences, comfortable as shade. Storm followed them, directing with ears and eyes, testing planks with the blunt certainty of a foreman. When Jack's crutch snagged a coil of wire and pitched him sideways, Storm stepped under the fall, shoulder braced. Jack's hand slid down the horse's neck like a prayer answered twice. In the late light, they'd stand at the edge of the pasture, watching the sun pour itself over the grass. Nora would tip her hat back and squint toward the ridge. "So," she'd say now, "that you've got a friend again, you still need people." Jack would run his palm along Storm's mane, feeling the steady pulse there. "People talk too much," he'd say. "He just listens." Nora's mouth would curve, amused, not offended. Sometimes people need to be listened to too. Maybe Jack would admit. And the look they'd share carried both the weight of what had been lost and the light of what could be. Nights came without dread. Storm stretched on the porch head on the top step of the slow metronome of his breathing marking time. Inside, Jack sat with his leg propped, a book open, but unread, the fire working its old alchemy on pain and memory. If he woke at midnight aching, he'd hear the scratch of hoof on wood, the soft huff through the screen door, and go back under, easily carried by a rhythm big enough for two. By week's end, the south fence really was fixed. They widened the pasture, mended the barn roof, where last winter had made a liar of his patchwork, and raised a gate that didn't groan when you looked at it. It wasn't just labor. It felt like a ritual, each nail driven a tally against the dark. One evening, after the last board slotted into place, they leaned on the top rail while the sky went purple around them. Storm grazed in the near field head, lifting now and then, as if checking the perimeter like any good partner. The air smelled of cut wood and cooling earth and something like gratitude. "Didn't think I'd get this back," Jack said. "Which part?" Nora asked. "All of it," he said simply. Snow came early that year, a soft rehearsal before the true cold. Jack woke to a world edged with white, and the fence lines drawn in frost, the mesa distant and clean, the skies so clear it sounded like a bell. He stood on the porch in his coat and watched Storm trot a slow circuit of the yard, breath blooming white around his muzzle. He spoke without meaning to. "Your freedom doesn't take anything from me," he said, voice low and sure. "It gave me a reason to keep breathing." Storm lifted his head, as if the words had weight he could feel. Nora arrived with 2 paper cups steaming through their lids, boots crunching the snow. She handed him coffee and followed his gaze to the horse. "What's the plan come spring?" she asked. Jack's eyes moved across the field to the line of hills beyond it, the sky beyond them. "Let him run," he said. Let him remember this is home, even if home is a place you leave and come back to. A small storm swept in that afternoon, a tidy quilt of gray that folded over the ranch. Jack fed the stove and then sat in the chair by the window. Storm curled himself under the porch eaves, where the snow couldn't reach hooves, tucked neck curved like a comma resting at the end of a sentence. Jack cracked the window an inch. Cold air slipped through, carrying the whisper of snow and the sharp scent of pine. The fire popped softly in answer. The whole house listened to wind, to breath, to the simple arithmetic of survival. 2 heartbeats, 1 cadence. There was no grand epiphany, just the steady recognition that the cabin was no longer a shelter for grief. It was a witness, a place where life had left its handprint and decided to stay. The snow thickened toward dusk, smoothing the yard into a single field of color. Jack's eyes closed. He saw the old photograph in his mind, the woman and the girl in the foal, and found that memory sat beside him without cutting. The pain that remained was honest, not hungry. It didn't ask for more than he could give. The wind turned playful now, a child tugging a sleeve. Storm's ear flicked. He exhaled, a ribbon of white unspooling in the dark. Inside, Jack's breath matched it, 2 measures of the same song. The winter held, but it no longer felt like a cage. It felt like a vow. Spring took the valley in its hands and pressed. Snow receded to the edges of shadow and memory. Water loosened itself from ice and ran laughing down the gullies. Hawks drew slow circles on the blue, writing their private script on air. Jack sat on the porch steps, a mug of coffee warming both hands, his eyes taking in the green without greed. He'd grown older in the quiet way, hair more silver than gray. Now shoulders notched with honest labor. But his gaze was steady bright as the morning he first carried the foal out of the storm. The sound came out of the distance, like a heart remembering its work, hoofbeats, regular and sure thudding against the deep drum of the earth. Jack looked up, frowning in concentration, and stood with effort that no longer embarrassed him. Across the flats, a cloud of red dust lifted like dawn within dawn. Then the shapes resolved mustangs in full run, a spill of motion and light aimed straight for the fence line. In the lead, a black stallion with shoulders like carved stone and a mane that broke the sun. Jack's breath caught. He didn't say the name so much as breathe it. Storm. The herd slowed to a charged stillness near the fence. Earth went quiet, except for the soft grind of hooves in gravel and the hum of insects waking early. Jack stepped forward into that silence, palms open. Storm stopped a yard from the rails, neck-arched eyes bright enough to burn a man clean. The herd behind him tossed their heads and called sharp, excited, impatient. Somewhere up on the ridge, a hawk cried once, as if to urge a decision. Jack reached out, laying his hand against the warm curve of Storm's neck. He felt the pulse under the skin, a fast river he'd learned by heart. "You hear it, don't you?" he said softly. "Your own kind calling." Storm blew air through his nostrils, pawed once, then stilled. The spring wind moved through the grass, making a sound like whispering. Jack looked past the horse to the mountains, smudged with gold, their faces lit with morning. "Go," he told him. The words cost him nothing and everything. "If that's where you belong, go. I'll be here when you come back." The stallion studied him, really studied eyes, steady, a depth there that had nothing to do with intelligence and everything to do with recognition. He leaned in and touched his forehead to Jack's shoulder, the pressure firm enough to be felt in bone. Warmth bled through coat and cloth. It was a brand of another kind. Storm loosed a clean, bright whinny, stepped back, and broke into a run. The herd opened like a door and folded around him, and together they arrowed across the valley mains, a dark river tails like pennants in the wind. Dust rose in a red ribbon between earth and sky, a sash tossed over the shoulder of the land. Jack watched until they became the same color as distance, and then nothing at all. The porch behind him held his shadow, and the echo of his words, which had been both a goodbye and a promise. Summer ripened around him, and the ranch settled into the long, slow breath of the dry season. Jack lived alone again, but the word no longer meant absence. The field kept the faint tracery of hoofprints where mornings had been spent together. The gate swung clean on its hinges. The new fence rails held the memory of his hand in their smooth grain. He brewed coffee before dawn and sat with the mug on his knee, watching the far edge of the meadow as if it told time. Sometimes Nora stopped by with fresh bread or peaches bruised and sweet from her trees. They ate on the porch steps, talking in the narrow register of people who know that silence is half the conversation. "Do you miss him?" she asked, once a smile in her voice, to soften the weight of the question. Jack shook his head slowly. "I don't miss him," he said. "I hear him. Every morning the wind comes up and the grass starts talking, and there he is." That night, and many after, he slept with the window open, letting the valley breathe into the room for the whir of insects, the scratch of grass against fence, the long slide of a coyote's song from the hills. Sometimes, in the not-quite darkness before dawn, he'd hear a cadence that wasn't wind at all. He'd smile into his pillow and say nothing to the empty room. He had learned how to keep a space inside him for whatever he loved to move through untrapped. The days stacked up not in a column to be measured, but like river stones smoothed useful good in the hand. Late summer came with sunsets that looked set on fire from within. One evening, while the sky poured itself over the western ridge in molten red, Jack heard hoofbeats again close, certain a rhythm he could have named blind. He reached for his cane and stepped onto the porch before his mind had fully formed the hope. Then hope didn't have to work at all. Storm stood at the gate, larger than Jack remembered the muscles along his shoulder carved by speed and weather. The black coat held a sheen the color of midnight rivers, and the eyes were softer, fuller, as if experience had polished them. Beside him stood a gray mare, fine-boned and alert, and behind them, two foals, one dark as a moonless night, one a smoky silver dancing their awkward, perfect first steps around the posts. The breath left Jack in a laugh he had not rehearsed. He went as far as the rail and stopped, hands gently open. Storm stepped forward first, head tilted, a low sound rolling from his chest. Jack whispered, "You found your home, didn't you?" The stallion turned to the others and gave a small, soft call. The foals sidled forward, necks extended, sniffing at the unfamiliar smell of a man who wasn't strange at all. They tiptoed along the bottom rail hooves, clicking on a low stone, ears flicking in surprise at their own daring. Nora reined in at the far corner of the yard, breathless with surprise and something like pride. "Would you look at that?" she said, dismounting and keeping her distance. "He brought the whole family to meet the man who saved his life." Jack's eyes shone without shame. "I promised to keep the door open," he said. "And he kept the kind of promise I didn't know a horse could make." Storm eased closer until the memory and the moment were the same. A black head resting against the palm of a man who had learned to let go, and in doing so, had been given back the world. The touch didn't last long. It didn't have to. Trust isn't measured by time, but by whether it arrives at all. For a while, they simply stood there, all of them within the same weather, while the sun stitched gold into everything it touched. When the light thinned to copper, and then to whine, the gray mare lifted her head and turned toward the southern ridge. The foals followed her attention, their bodies suddenly urgent with the idea of somewhere. Storm stood last, as was his way now, guard bridge witness. He looked back. Jack raised a hand palm out, not calling, not claiming, just a sign sent across a small distance, and a great understanding. The stallion's ears flicked forward. For a heartbeat, the whole valley seemed to balance on the small plain between them. The herd moved. Storm's hooves struck sparks from stone as he followed, and the dust rose behind them in a ribbon that caught the last light and turned it to silk. The red earth breathed them in and gave back silence. Jack remained by the open barn door, which swung lightly in the evening breeze. Air poured down from the hills, smelling of sage and wild mint, and the faintest trace of rain that never falls this time of year. Nora stood at his shoulder and laid a hand briefly against his arm. "You did what no one around here ever learned how to do," she said. "You loved something you could never keep." Jack kept his eyes on the horizon, where the herd had become a new line in an old story. His voice came slow and easy. "They say cowboys spend their lives trying to hold what can't be held." He smiled, the kind that deepens rather than lifts. Sometimes the only way to keep the truth of a thing is to open your hand. The last of the herd slipped behind the red rock, as if returning to the chapter where they'd first been written. Overhead, a high veil of cloud caught the sun's final blaze and wore it like a crown. The wind moved through the porch boards under the eaves around the chair by the stove, and found the steady drum of a man's heart, unhurried now, content to keep time with the land it loved. In that hush, a far-off whinny lifted and fell thin with distance, thick with memory. It touched the cabin and went on. Jack closed his eyes and nodded once to no one in particular. "Thank you," he said. The door stayed open. The night came in as an equal, and Red Mesa